In this video, we're going to talk about guidelines for case study analyses. To begin, I'm going to explain the 5 steps that we're going to use to formally analyze case studies. These steps are on page XXIII and XXIV of your book and posted as a PDF on our course Canvas page. These steps will be an important part of your case study analysis papers and will be helpful for the Write Your Own Case Study assignment. In addition, we'll also use these steps while analyzing our weekly case studies moving forward. These steps outlined in this video give us a consistent framework to use to carefully analyze moral decisions. This can be very useful in the framework of our class. You can also use this process for any moral decision, both inside and outside this class. So I think that's pretty cool. Hopefully this is something that you can use in your life outside of class. All right. So there are 5 steps that we're going to talk through for case study analysis. Step 1 is summarizing the main problem and its setting. Step 2 involves listing possible ways of responding to the problem. Step 3 involves identifying moral principles and theories that most directly apply to the case. Step 4 is to identify and justify one response that you think is morally best. And then, finally, step 5, explain why the other possible responses are not as acceptable. Okay, now we'll go through each of these, and I will expand on them. Step 1, summarize the main problem and its settings. So, while you're doing this, you should ask yourself, what are the essential elements of the situation, and what is the ethical problem at issue? Summarize the case in your own words, writing as though you were explaining it to someone who is not familiar with it. Now, this is important. A good way to actually test if you've accomplished this is to give your summary of the problem to someone outside the class and have them read it. If they can make sense of it, then you've accomplished what you should be aiming for. Some helpful questions to ask yourself while you're doing this. Who are the key players? Who's affected by the outcome? Are there other important facts that are being assumed and left unstated? Now, this last piece about important facts being assumed and left unstated is very important in our moral reasoning. A lot of times, things are hiding in the background as unstated assumptions, and it's important as we perform our moral analyses to draw these out. While your summary need not be exhaustive, but it should identify the salient facts for your reader. Okay, so you don't have to include every single tiny detail about the case study, but you do need to identify the things that are important for the decision moving forward. And finally, be careful not to alter the facts of the case. Now, this can especially happen if you have a particularly strong view on how you think you want the morally right thing to do in the situation. Sometimes as we're doing that and we're reformulating the case, we don't do so in a neutral way. Instead, we sort of tilt the retelling towards the way we want things to go. So you want to avoid that. You want to summarize the problem, not present it in a way that only allows your chosen option to be the one that you pick. Okay, moving on to number 2. List the possible ways of responding to the problem. So, what are the possible responses to this problem? That is, in what ways might a person or a society act if they were faced with this problem? List and briefly explain each of these options that seem most likely, both good and bad. There'll usually be at least 3 possibilities for every problem. So these would be the 2 opposed extremes, and then some kind of mixture of the 2. So if we are applying this to the story that we looked at about Bill, we might say that the 2 extremes are to either turn Bill into the manager, or to not turn Bill into the manager. But we can see that there's also a third option that's kind of a mixture of these 2. Right? So this might be that we go talk to Bill and tell him if he doesn't stop stealing, that we'll turn him into the manager, or some other variation on this. Now, There can be many more than 3. I certainly leave it up to you to lay out as many as you like, but generally speaking, there should be at least 3. In most cases, 2 won't be quite enough, so that's something to keep in mind while you're moving forward. While some responses may be obvious, others may require you to think more carefully and creatively. So you want to be sure that you try to work through many or all of the possible responses that you can come up with. And be sure to include the response that you think is best. This is the response that you're ultimately going to defend as right. So it'd be pretty silly to list the possible responses but not include the one that you are going to pick. So make sure that you include the one that you're going to pick. However, you also want to make sure that you identify responses that you don't agree with or that you don't think are best. And you're going to use these again in part 3 and 5. So it's not enough to only come up with the response that you favor. You also need to come up with other possible responses. Importantly, responses that you don't agree with, and some that you may really not agree with. That's part of the exercise. Okay, moving on to 3. Identify moral principles and theories that most directly apply to the case. Moral principles are the principles that you use to justify your moral thinking in this case. All right? So depending on the type of case, this could include things like it's wrong to steal or you shouldn't kill people. The idea is, for identifying the moral principle, is what is it that is making you respond this way in this particular situation. And normally that principle is going to be something that applies in other situations as well to guide your behavior. While you're doing this, however, be careful to include only moral principles so that you don't confuse your analysis with legal principles and other principles from the non-moral realms. Now, this is probably most likely going to come up with regard to legal principles because sometimes we might think that, for example, stealing is wrong because stealing is against the law, right? But notice that if we think that stealing is wrong, and the thing that motivates that is that it's against the law, we actually are holding a moral principle that it's wrong to break the law, right? I explained this in one of the other videos from last week. So we want to make sure that we don't accidentally include claims from the other moral realms. Also, make sure to identify the principles that support each of your possible responses in part 2. While you're doing this, it's important to treat each response as if you thought it was the right thing to do, even if you don't. You want to consider the best version of each possibility. So what I mean here is as you work through the possibilities and you're trying to identify the moral principles that would motivate this possibility, you want to make sure that you're taking the possibility seriously, even if you really disagree with it. So again, in the case of Bill, it sort of broke down that there are 2, broadly speaking, ways of approaching it, right? There was to turn Bill in because stealing is wrong, or to not turn Bill in because you value friendship more. Now, there's a lot of different ways to sort of pull these things apart, but when we're trying to identify the moral principles that move forward each of the views, you want to make sure that you take each one seriously, even if you don't agree with it. It's very important to do this. All right. So for the final paper, you're also going to want to show how various ethical theories relate to the case. So until we get to these ethical theories, starting in Chapter 5, we don't have access to them. But once we do have access to them, it'll be important to reference the ethical theories. So this can often be done simply by stating the theory's essential idea as a fundamental principle. So as we're going to see, some examples of these fundamental principles can include things like always act as to maximize the resulting overall utility, or never treat a person as a means only. And what these principles mean and how they apply to these ethical theories will start to make sense once we get to dig into these ethical theories in a few weeks. All right, Moving on to 4. Identify and justify the one response that you think is morally best. Now, this is probably what most of us came here for, right? But justifying your chosen response from out of the possible responses that you listed in Part 2 requires you to provide moral arguments in support of your response. So, to do this, it's helpful to use the pattern of moral reasoning or moral reflection, which we're going to talk about next week, or both. These will be covered in Chapter 4, Parts 4 and 5 next week, as I mentioned. So try to offer the most compelling argument that you can for your view. And for your final paper, these arguments should incorporate ethical theories as well. And we'll worry about that when we get there. So don't worry about ethical theories. They will make sense when we get to them. Now, step 5. Explain why the other possible responses are not as acceptable. Now, as far as I'm concerned, this is actually the most important part of the process. It's pretty easy, I think, to just jump to some sort of conclusion about what we think and why, right? But really, the hard thinking and the action happens in carefully thinking about why the other side is wrong. So, people who argue for their own view are merely biased. Morally thinking requires us to also see a problem from the perspective of others. So, your analysis should also address the most important remaining responses from Part 2, explaining why each is morally less desirable than the response that you chose in Part 4. While you're doing this, don't forget to reference the moral principles and theories that you identified in Part 3. In arguing against other responses, you don't have to show that they're all wrong, only that your response is better justified than any of the others. All right, so to conclude, I'm going to go back over the 5 steps for case study analysis. Step 1, summarize the main problem and its setting. Step 2, list possible ways of responding to the problem. Step 3, identify moral principles and theories that most directly apply to the case. Step 4, identify and justify the one response that you think is morally best. And step 5, explain why the other possible responses are not as acceptable.